Us for our wrap-up Open Education Week with a very special session, Beyond OER, Open Educational Practices and Equity for All. But before we jump in, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place with an acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways on which we come together. As we learn and teach through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respects to the ancestors and elders of the beautiful lands we are located, as well as the traditional custodians of all the lands on which you may be learning and teaching, where education has taken place for many thousands of years. Today, we are coming to you from the Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. So the format of the session today will be in two parts. First, we will commence with a panel discussion on the intersection of open educational practices and equity. And then we'll roll into the launch of our exciting new OER textbook, Communication Concepts, which was developed by one of our exceptional panelists with contributions from her wonderful students. So just a bit of housekeeping. We welcome questions on Slido and chat if you are so inclined to ask questions. If you are with us in person today, we also welcome you to pop your hand up and we'll send over a microphone. So without further ado, I will introduce you to our wonderful panelists. So Dr. Danielle Hamilton, who is our Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, is a Senior Lecturer in the Learning Design team at Deakin University. She leads university-wide strategic academic capability building programs designed to maximise the participation and achievement of all learners. Danielle has extensive experience in the fields of arts, education, accessibility and inclusion. Her research pursuits centre on experimental projects that explore the ethics of relationships at the intersections of bodies and technologies. Sorry. No, all good, Danny. Okay, next we have the lovely Dr. Rebecca Muir, who is the Coordinator for Disability Inclusion at Deakin University's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion team. A self-described neurospicy practitioner researcher in disability and diversity inclusion, Beck utilises her combination of professional, academic, research and lived experiences to design and deliver initiatives, training programs and projects designed to increase disability inclusion across Deakin. Her research is primarily focused on the role of inclusive recruitment in developing diverse, inclusive workplaces and developing hidden disability inclusive service environments. And finally, we have the lovely Dr. Erin Hawley, who is a Senior Lecturer in Communication in Deakin School of Communication and Creative Arts. She currently leads an innovative student-centred teaching in the Master of Communication. Erin's research investigates environmental communication for, by and about children. Her work brings children and young people into the discipline of environmental communication by exploring the construction of green audiences in children's media and the mainstreaming of young voices in global conversations about the climate emergency. And finally, we have our panel facilitator, the wonderful Angie Williamson, who is an education librarian from Deakin. So Angie, I will let you take it from here and thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa, for that wonderful introduction. So we'll kick it straight off with a bit of an overview. So the theme of our Open Access Week this year is community over commercialisation. Open access often focuses on open access research, but open can also be applied to education. Open educational resources are resources that can be used for teaching and learning, but they're open and they can be more than just open access. They can be free to use rather than just free to read. Resources can be developed by academics as well as students, or both at the same time, to develop textbooks or smaller resources that are available then for others to use and adapt. Data recently used in the Australian Universities Accord indicates that student poverty is increasing and the financial difficulties are often cited as a reason for students withdrawing from studies. The Accord intends a holistic approach of achieving equity of participation and attainment and places the students at the centre of higher education. Open education can support these aims, reducing student costs by utilising and developing open resources, and open practices place student equity at the centre of representation and equity of access. So to understand the concepts more fully, I might first ask Danny to give us an introduction to open educational practices and where we might be in this space currently.
So open educational practice is an emerging field in Australia. And I would like to say that open education resources are really pretty well understood. And I think it's thanks to the efforts of, say, Deakin University Library and other libraries have sort of led the charge in this space. But I suppose what I speak for is open practice more broadly as a way into the open educational resource space. So I suppose I'm setting the terrain, I'm setting the table for us for this conversation right now by saying that to really clarify, I am an open practitioner who does not make open educational resources. And the reason that I call myself an open educational practitioner is because it is my practice of open that I am cultivating over many years, because I philosophically believe that openness is about becoming, and it is about accumulating practice over a lifetime. And it is about finding ways of being open wherever you're situated. It's very punk rock, because what it says is it's about building communities, and it's about bringing people together. It's about being open and honest with other people. It's about becoming. And when I say it's about becoming, of course we're open, but we also can't be all open all the time, right? Because it's not safe to be all open all the time. So within a philosophy of becoming, there is also the ethical right to be closed. So I want to situate this conversation and say that we are all here because we care about openness, and open meets you where you are, where the ground meets your feet. And what Angie does here with open educational resources is building the capability of our academics at Deakin, of which I've been a part. I work with Rebecca Muir regularly in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and she is an open practitioner who is really sets the scene at Deakin University and this incredible focus on representation, language, lived experience, neurodiversity. She lives and breathes this. She shows it to us all, and that's what makes her an open practitioner. I've worked with Erin for many years now, not closely, but a great admirer of Erin's work, because she just embodies openness, and it has come to her through open educational resources, have given her a language, but she has always already been open. So my challenge to you as we talk today is to think, where does openness come to you and where does it begin? Because it's not going to end. And it's really about how you practice it in your everyday life is what I'm advocating for. Is it my 5 minutes, Angie? I'm so scared. Oh, 2 minutes. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Well, I think because we've got much more conversations, I'm going to hand over to Beck because she has a lot to say. And I think that sets the scene quite nicely. Good. I told you that would happen.
So, Beck, can you talk us through equity and open education and how they're linked?
So this is something that I admit I've learned so much from you, so very much. When we think about equity, when we think about things like open practice, I feel like that sense that you gave us of becoming, that constant curiosity, that constant process of navigation, of discussion, of working through, but also a sense of vulnerability. I often find, not only in the open space, but in my practice full stop, that we think about inclusion and accessibility as something that we reach the destination of. We are now accessible, we are now inclusive. Our open practice is now inclusive. I think when we change the dialogue around that into something that becomes a process of interpretation, mystery, finding the dragons on the edge of the map of what we know, what we don't know, and renegotiating our understanding shaped around that perspective, we're able to create a much fuller, richer, and indeed much more inclusive open education space. One thing that I wanted to tie back to that you mentioned, and I absolutely agree with you, I don't necessarily fit the definition of an open practitioner myself, because my outputs, such as they are are not in those traditional formats that you might look for, such as a book, these sort of things. My approach has been very much informed by my admiration for you and what I've learnt through watching and mimicking your experiences and your journey in my own work as well, of that process of looking at where I have made the assumption around inclusivity and equity and access to a resource that has not necessarily been cemented into the practice, into that supposedly openness. One thing that you mentioned as well was around the idea of creating those boundaries too, that sometimes it's not safe to be open. This is absolutely the case. I feel like what it is to be inclusive in the open education space, though, is having an environment where people can choose to self-exclude. So when the imposition or when the decision of inclusion, exclusion is taken from people wanting to be into that space, we start to create a space where there is already a boundary, and that boundary might not necessarily be one that someone can climb or can work through. So by creating spaces where people can choose to self-exclude, I think that already changes that dialogue to be more inclusive. But on that point as well, and one thing that I know that we've all discussed today is around what goes into those definitions of inclusion, of accessibility, of openness. How is that defined in a particular context? A lot of the times in my experience, we'll look at accessibility as being this or this. There will be no two choices. There'll be no third choice. You can have, in the case of my thesis, one example was you can have a large print book or you can have a recipe book. You can't have both. When we start to create those boundaries around things like the open environment, what decisions are we already making about what inclusion is? Which then leads us into, I think, with that setting of the scene, leads us into discussing, are we talking more about open educative practice as that journey again of becoming, but a multiplicity of journeys and a multiplicity of experiences. And through everyone having their own different experience, creating something at the end that is very open, ironically, very open, very raw, very, very true, but not necessarily the same for every person, which is incredibly exciting. And on that, I will hand over to our wonderful Erin.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks, Danny. It's really lovely hearing you talk about open practice, and that gives me a context in which to think about the work that I have been doing, the work that we have been doing. I'm here today to talk about a textbook, an object, but the way that you're talking about open practice makes me realise that that object is really just a part of a broader culture. And that the reason that this textbook exists is because there is already openness and collaboration in my teaching practice, in our learning community, in how we approach our discipline, and that this is part of an ongoing collaboration, and that when we teach, we are collaborating, and the members of our learning community are our collaborators. And so there is always openness then in what we are doing. And I know a student said to me a long time ago, long before I thought of writing this textbook, she said to me that what she enjoyed about studying communication was that it allowed her to bring all that was within her to the table. And I think that really embodies what we're talking about today. So to me, that's the lived experience of open practice. It is not just the production of an output, it is also every single day in the classroom. Yes.
I think that's fantastic because we've got the philosophical ideas around open ed as well as the very practical, how do we go about and do this? So Catherine Cronin in one of her chapters talks about that open ed initiatives often take two forms. So the first seeks to transform or empower individuals and groups within existing structures, and the second seeks to transform the structures and relationships themselves. So as a vehicle for equity, how can open ed practices be best implemented to maximise the impact for equity? Go for it.
So my I suppose my practice rubber really hit the road with Deakin University Library, empowered by Hero, who is here. And it was very much around what could open practice be for Deakin University, and really expand and explore the boundaries systemically of systemic change. So the thrust of open practice for Deakin was really around how do we go right to the heart of the system so that we can actually enable people like Erin as in her academic work. Because I suppose the context that you're probably all missing from me is I'm one of those shadow workers in the back of the university working in academic capability building. So I work on strategic projects. So I'm not working at the cold face, working with students, teaching. I'm working with academics, trying to find ways to say to them, how can I help you? How can I unburden you? What can I do for you to make the experience of being an educator at Deakin a little bit easier, a little bit more open, and a little bit better? And I suppose the tool that most appeals to me is open practice, which we have to fight for in higher education every single day. And I think about open it as a sort of like a confluence of these really important ideas that we want to aspire to at Deakin. And in higher education, you know, the mission of higher education itself is to openness. Think about where knowledge transfer and translation happens. It happens between people with ideas who really care about ideas that matter, communicating openly with each other, sharing ideas, being vulnerable. So I suppose you can probably feel it, like, oh, this is an urgency and a passion. And again, I think of the work that the library does around this, the work that you do and Lisa does, and the urgency of that work, the systems and the processes that we have to put in place, but also the systems and policies that need to be there to support them. Because we can't have people doing this labour unacknowledged. So again, am I speaking too fast? But I feel like that's enough said. That's how I feel about it, and that's where I stand. So I stand as an open practitioner, and what I stand for is openness between us all, because we're all got to work here together to fight, to be able to be open with each other. I'll hand to you.
I want to tie on to the being open with each other. So I think it's one of the things that we kind of assume that we do. And I think it's much like communication, like we were talking about before. We assume that we're very proficient at it. And we assume that some of these conversations almost don't need to be had because they've been had and we know what they are. I think one of the things I often think about with equity is that we set boundaries around when people can engage in that. So say we might lock something down behind a paywall so people can't access that until they meet this criteria. They can't access information on a course or something until they're a student, something like this. And I think, again, when it comes to that communication, we almost tend to have these conversations too late with an assumption that everyone already knows what they are. And particularly when it comes to creating an equitable, open, inclusive, accessible, everything like that, open space. We assume that all of those words that I just ran through, everyone already knows what they mean. And everyone's already working on the same assumption about what that's going to mean for their practice. I think with higher education as well, I think sometimes there can be a pushback against openness because of fear of what could be in that space and how that might be received without the mediation of someone who's a knowledge expert around that area. And I think when we do that too, we're again creating that boundary around what people can and can't be engaged with and when. So I'm not sure how to work through that one. I think that's something that we can only really do by building multiple communities, almost multiple different spaces, so we can still have that sense of safety, like you say, have those boundaries, because we do need them around some things. But having different spaces where different people can find and can be and can create and can come together on a journey that isn't the same for everyone, but works alongside each other. It's like group of people walking on the road. Sometimes you'll bump into each other. Sometimes you'll walk straight past them, but you know they're there. You just don't know when you're going to meet them. So I think that might be one of the ways to build that more equitable environment around open practice and, yeah, broaden out our understandings as well as what it is to be inclusive in those spaces.
Just following on from that, can I ask a question without notice? When you're talking about safe spaces, what do you see as the role of policy in that sort of creating those spaces?
So for anyone who doesn't know, my doctoral focus was on hidden disability inclusive service environments. And one of the things that kept coming up is there is kind of this assumption that we'll do some training, we'll do some renegotiation, everyone will be now up to date with it, and now inclusion happens. Go out there and be inclusive. Yay! And one of the things that we tend to forget is that when we undertake training, these sort of things, the policies that were in place prior to training reinforce the prior to training behaviours, the prior to training expectations. They set the environment in which inclusion can now occur. So I think when we look at policies, these sort of things, I think they're exceptionally important because, like, my research alone shows that people will use them as checklists almost for their own conduct, their own approach to open practice, for example. So this is how I can be open to a minimum standard. This is what it means. But they can also be damaging if we look at them as isolated outside the open space. We have to locate any policies, anything like this within the open space as living documents. The second they become a static document, the second they again reinforce pre to learning behaviours. So I think they're powerful, but with some negotiation around that, what that means.
Okay, so when we look at open practice and inclusive teaching, how can they both be brought together to create a more cohesive learner diversity experience?
I think they have to be brought together, and I think they come together. I'm reflecting on my own teaching practice now, and I think what I'm hearing from both Danny and Beck is this idea of we can give names to things, but we have to be very careful when we do so, because when we give names to things, we exclude other things. And so the realities of being in the classroom is you're not going to give names to what you do, but you know that you're driven to teach in a certain way or be in a certain way. So I guess that's my roundabout way of saying it's there. It's an important part of what we do. It's something we do have to fight for, you know, for recognition for, and fight to keep as part of our teaching practice. But it is a difficult thing to give, to have represented, for example, in formal structures like academic workload. But it is there. Yeah.
And so, Erin, what did you find was the lived experience of going through the development of something like this with student involvement? Did you find that brought the equity into the resource that you've developed?
Absolutely. It was that was one of the joys of this process, is that, from my point of view, is that I was writing alongside these other amazing writers who are, so many of them are here today. So we were co-writing, we were co-thinking through something that one person alone can't think through, which is what is communication. So that was the lived experience. It was also an extension of what we do in our learning and teaching practice. So when we talk about these concepts in the classroom, when we create content around them, whether it's my own content that I create or whether it's the students' content that they're creating through their work, really what you see in the textbook is that it's an extension of that in a very public-facing way, which I think for all of us was a bit of moving outside our comfort zone and actually writing and speaking to a global audience, which is amazing that this book can actually do that. But to me, yes, that was the lived experience of it. It was coming together to explore a concept that we find difficult to explore from one point of view.
That's great. So I think that's sort of the perfect segue into our book launch, which is the next part of our session. So let me see if I can flick this slide over. Nope. Nope. Erin, did you want to stand at the... Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I'm really, really thrilled to be here launching this collaborative co-authored textbook, Communication Concepts. So to celebrate its launch, I want to tell you a little bit of the story of its development. And there are many, many reasons why we might embark on the journey of creating an open educational resource, an open textbook. We've heard about some of the important ones today in the broader context of open practice. My reason for creating this textbook started quite a few years ago when I taught this unit, Communication Concepts, for the very first time. And as we often do when we teach something for the first time, I made some minor changes, some minor tweaks to the unit to make it a bit more diverse, a bit more engaging. I made some changes to the readings, to the case studies, to the examples, even to the images that were used on the unit site. They were small changes. They were made on the fly during a busy trimester. But one of my students said to me afterwards that because of those changes, she could see herself in the unit content. She could see herself and she felt seen. And that comment really stayed with me. What does it mean to be able to see yourself in what you learn? What does it mean to feel seen? How can educators make it easier for students to join, to participate in, to move through, and yes, to see themselves in a learning environment? Those questions led me here. So Communication Concepts, which is the name of the textbook, is also, for those who don't know, it's the name of the first core unit in the Master of Communication course at Deakin. We have a very diverse cohort. Our MCOM students come from many, many different backgrounds. Some of them have years of experience in the industry. They've been journalists, they've been graphic designers, they've been PR practitioners, TV producers, and more. Others are newcomers to the discipline. They've come from backgrounds in health, in science, in sports, in politics, and more. Some are literally coming to us from far away, from regional and remote areas in Australia. Others are coming from busy lives where they juggle the demands of work, study, family life, applying to be a doctor of medicine. So we have Australian students studying alongside students who are coming from India, from Pakistan, from Vietnam, from the Philippines, from Kenya, Nigeria, from too many places to name. And because Communication Concepts is the very first unit taken in the first trimester of study, these students are stepping into Australia and coming to Deakin for the very first time, sometimes weeks before they come into the week one classroom. For others, week one is a daunting return to study after years or even decades in the workforce. All of these students are passionate about communication and they're interested in our rapidly changing communication landscape. And many of them are already active communicators themselves. They are content creators, they are storytellers. Our cohort is sparky and they deserve learning resources that reflect that sparkiness. So the children's author Roald Dahl once wrote that children deserve parents who are sparky, not stodgy. I think too that students deserve learning resources that are sparky and that reflect their own lively, interesting, diverse qualities that allow them to see themselves and not just see themselves, but see others. Unfortunately, textbooks and journal articles about communication theory often err on the side of being stodgy rather than sparky. Communication textbooks aren't always interesting to read or exciting to read, and they often don't do justice to the complex, multifaceted, ever-changing nature of communication as a concept. They also don't always do justice to the complexity and diversity of the people who read them. Which is why I decided to write this book, and it is Master of Communication students who have provided its spark of life. So each of my 13 co-authors have provided a case study showing communication in action. What that means is that readers of this book will learn about the theories and concepts that help us better understand communication, audiences, storytelling, and identity. But they also read and learn about online dating, women in sport, media representations of Meghan Markle. They read about intersectionality, personal branding, social movement activism in France, and anthropomorphized animals in the Philippines. They read about smartphone use, personal experiences as a news consumer, and they read about fandom of Doctor Who, K-pop, and everything everywhere all at once. Although I personally am a smartphone user, a news consumer, and yes, a Doctor Who fan, I would never have chosen those case studies. And that is precisely the point. As a group of writers and thinkers, we have come together to activate our collective intelligence, to explore a knotty concept that can never fully be understood from one person's perspective. Collective intelligence is a communication concept in its own right. It explains the phenomenon that as individuals, there are limits to our knowledge, to our expertise and our experience. But as communities, we can pool our resources, work collaboratively towards a common goal, and produce an output or achieve an outcome that is beyond our individual limits. So we have used our collective intelligence to produce something greater than the sum of its parts, an exploration of communication from a range of different individual, cultural, and professional perspectives. We've taken the scholarly object of communication and passed it between us and tipped and turned it so that we can explore it from our different vantage points. The goal of this book is to elucidate communication theory and connect it to real-world contexts, to professional practice, and to everyday life. The book starts with the idea of communication challenges, the notion that the biggest challenges facing our world at the moment, war, social inequality, climate change, health crises, always have a communication aspect to them. The way that we talk about things, the names we give them, the way we represent ourselves, the way we represent others, the way we shape and transform meaning and move through the media landscape, all of this has impact. How we communicate matters. What we communicate about matters. And good communication can save the world. This is where the book starts, but it ends with participatory culture, another communication concept and the subject of our final chapter. And really, there are some interesting points of intersection between participatory culture as we understand it in communication studies and open practice, as we've been talking about it today. As an open textbook, this book was not just collaborative, but it lends itself to further collaboration. It's licensed in a way that allows and encourages modification through the remixing and adaptation of content. There are low barriers to entry to the creation, sharing, reading, and adapting of this book, and it exists within a culture that promotes participation. So what I have always appreciated about participatory culture as a theory and as a way of understanding the communication landscape is its focus on the people, not the technology, not the platform. A technological tool can be interactive, but only a culture can be participatory. And this is to do with the actions of people and the value that we might place on sharing, mentorship, creativity, and diverse ways of thinking and knowing. And it's partly because of this connection between participatory culture and open practice that I think there is so much to explore in terms of using the affordances of OER to teach communication theory. So one of the things Angie asked me to talk about today were the challenges that I experienced along the way. And I have to say there weren't many, but I think one of the main challenges for me that is worth talking about today relates to workload. And by workload, I don't so much mean the time it takes to make the OER itself. This was a 2-year journey, as my students know. It was a long journey, but that's not what I mean when I say workload. I mean where it fits in the academic workload. Co-authoring a textbook is no small undertaking, but what exactly is it? It's not one of the usual practices we incorporate into teaching, although it is widely known that teaching practice encompasses a whole range of things outside what it says in our PDs. when it comes to teaching, our workload allocation model as academics attends to seminar delivery, unit site management, marking, and student engagement. None of these things is quite creating an OER. Neither is it research or service. It sits somewhere between the three. So the question isn't so much how do we find time for open educational practice, but how do we find a place for it? So that to me was really the only challenge in what was otherwise a very, very rewarding journey. I told you that this journey began when a student spoke to me years ago about seeing herself in the learning environment. Well, very recently I had another inspiring conversation with a student that I want to pass on to you. You see, this textbook, while it has been launched today, has been in use for a whole trimester with this year's Communication Concepts cohort. And I was speaking recently, so it has been used, and yes, it has been cited. I was speaking recently with a student who was struggling. I won't go into why he was struggling. He was finding study very difficult for a number of very important reasons. He was taking on a full load, which in itself is very, very challenging. And he told me the subjects he's taking are very difficult. He always feels that he's missing something. The seminars are hard. The readings are even harder. Except, he said, for the Communication Concepts textbook. When he reads this book, he said, everything makes sense. I had another student out of the blue email me partway through the trimester to say, wow, thanks for the incredible textbook. I've been teaching for a long time and I have never had someone email me to thank me for the textbook. And I really want to pass this thanks on to my co-authors. I'm very grateful to you, as I hope you know, but this thanks is coming from students like yourself, who because of you can now see themselves in the learning environment. Thank you.
That's fantastic to get that sort of feedback while you're teaching the unit. That's just, that's. Have you had any other comments about the book? Say from colleagues or anyone external?
I have to say, not everyone understands why you would do something like this. So some of the questions I've had from colleagues have been why. But I think when you explain how it fits into the rest of the work that you do in creating a unit and engaging with students, they do understand. So I think there's still work to be done to explain to people what this means, what it looks like, and why you might do it. Mm.
So now we might open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask any of the panellists. Lisa and Dom have microphones. So if anyone does have a question, if you're in the room, feel free to put up your hand and we'll bring the microphone over.
Thank you. And thank you for some incredible insights and some really profoundly moving philosophy behind open. It's been great to hear everything. I'm just wondering if you could speak to, if you're familiar with it, Sarah Lambert's research and how that can kind of bring social justice lens to open practice and equity in Australia.
Yeah, Sarah Lambert's work is phenomenal. You're right. And I think what she challenges us to do is really think deeply about what we're doing. Like open is not just a given. Like it's one of those things where it can very quickly be, co-opted. And I think when Sarah Lambert challenges us in that sort of OER space or open assessment or open pedagogy, like if you really sort of extend it right out in terms of teaching practice, I think what she, again, I suppose that's why I keep going back to the philosophy and going back to systemic change. And I'm just going to say this is you and educators like you is what gets me out of bed in the morning. I will fight for you. I will fight for you for my whole career. I will fight for you because this is what Sarah Lambert actually is asking us to do. Is it's not just like an object that you make and do. It's not. It's process-oriented practice is what we're really talking about. And I know that Sarah's work is much more complex than that. But for me, I'm just saying I'm a holistic person, and I'm really thinking about how can this machine be turned around? What are the structures underpinning it? And when Sarah Lambert's talking about social justice, she's talking about how do people have access to these things? How do we democratize education? Well, it really does start like with just every fiber of what we're working with and everybody pulling together every day and just being mindful and thinking, how can this be more open? How can we include people better? How can we engage with our society better? How can, so yeah, sorry, I get very emotional about this. This is the mission. What Sarah, the social justice side, and what Sarah, that's why she's so important voice. That is the mission. This is social justice. And probably the most important stakeholders of higher education are the ones we talk about the least, and that's society. And higher education is the engine room of social change and transformation, which I think is what Sarah Lambert is really about for me. So yeah, did you?
For Sarah, the key thing that always jumps out at me is the vulnerability of saying, I don't know, and the vulnerability of asking. It takes an enormous amount of questioning and courage and self-reflection and conviction and, again, vulnerability to be able to say, why? And I think when it comes to open practice equity, it might be a vulnerability of asking, why do we define it like that? Why are we assuming open means this? It could be the vulnerability of saying, is it though? So that's always a key takeaway I take from her work when reflecting on this space. But I think she also, in her own way, gives me this perspective that to fight to ask a question and to fight to raise that question up and to fight to give that question space is also part of what needs to happen around the open space, inclusion, equity, everything. But it's not, again, an endpoint. It's a conversation that we keep having and keep discussing. So that's what I take away from her. But I know her work is so much larger than that, but that's always the part that jumps out to me.
I suppose the thing I find is looking at Erin's book, it nails Sarah's themes perfectly, because she talks about 3 types of social justice. So the redistributive, so the economic side, so you're saving students for not buying a textbook. The recognitive, so recognising students within the work, which is exactly it, as well as the representation of the students in there as well. So I think it completely fits the exact idea of that was behind Sarah's work there. So excellent. Thank you, Erin.
I would say I knew that when I went into it, but I didn't.
Lisa, have we got any questions online?
We do have a couple. I'll start with one. So, how does open practice in the education sphere differ from open practice in research? Is there a philosophical difference or a practical one?
Is that one? I'll take it. So, for me, and again, this is contested territory, right? So I'm just saying this is where I stick my stake in the ground. And I would say, if I'm an open practitioner and I sit in the centre, I'm an academic. I publish. I do teach on occasion, and I do academic capability building work, and I build communities. That is all the practices of open. So I do publish open access when I can. And that is part of the practices that I engage in to express my open practice. And so when I suppose from my perspective, all of it is open for me. I am an open practitioner, and the things that I do, I work to be open. And again, open access is, and I think we got Lauren here, like, and you talk about it so beautifully around, the different ways of engaging in open access, which I'm still grappling with. And I have so much to learn, so like again, we think about the libraries leading the charge in this space, so important, because I've got to be educated in this space. I'm still learning. And it's a practice I'm trying to get better at. And I'm not quite sure, because the publishing house is sort of telling me like, oh no, this is a really good way to do it. And I'm like, is it? Is this open? Is it really open? Is what I'm doing right? I'm happy that I'm asking those questions. I don't know. And I'm living uncertainty every day about, is this open? Am I doing the right thing? And I'm going to get real comfortable with that because I don't know, but I'm trying every day. So the answer is all of it for me.
Next question. Oh,
So when I told my kids I was coming here today and I said there's a textbook and talked about obviously the communication concepts, their first comment was, oh, when you write a textbook, you do another edition every couple of years, so everyone has to buy it again. They can't sell it secondhand. Now, these are high school students who've already worked out the system. And they said, why would you write a textbook, put all that effort in for free? The question isn't that, because but how do we encourage more people to do that? Because the cost of textbooks is extraordinary. And it really does open up education to all.
Yeah, thanks, Deanne. That's such a really good question. I think I'm not sure I have the answer. Maybe others on the panel have the answer, but I think we need to keep asking the question. And I think it's fantastic that all of you have participated in this and that you can have those conversations with your kids and with other students and with your colleagues, because I honestly do think that part of it is it just needs to be more widely understood as a pathway to communication, as a pathway to learning. So I think more conversations about it is part of the answer. But I'm sure others have other suggestions.
When you were saying that, I had the trauma-induced memory of buying like all of my textbooks for my first year at uni, and I could buy like a $1,000 TV stand, or I could buy 2 textbooks. It's like, my God, I was so broke. I think, aside from my reflective trauma, thank you. So I think one of the things that I've found quite interesting around Australia's culture of openness is there seems to be a little bit of a reluctance to move towards more open education resources as in outputs. And I think part of that is, as much as we don't like to, we are still quite traditional. And there can be hesitance to move towards new things. I think having conversations like this is one way of showing people that it is possible. You're not alone in navigating this space. You can create really, really great resources. You can contribute to a developing practice. I think that fear and that conservativeness tends to be some of the reasons why we haven't moved as far into open as I'd like to see.
She speaks again. But I do have things to say, because I think that this comes back, it's like all the way back around to the beginning and the setting of the table and saying this is big, and what it means is openness, even like within the university and within the divisions, and all of us linking arms together and saying, like, how can we progress each other's cause in this space? Like Angie and I, we've collaborated for many years, haven't we, over open? And I've worked in a central division in academic capability building, and my job is to make space for this. My job is to lobby and to say this practice has value, and that the day that open educational resource developers can go to their workload allocation model and say, I developed an open education. I see you, it's right. It's say, I've just created an open education resource and that is valued the same as an academic publication, which it is. That's the day the turning of the tide moment, because then all of a sudden your work is recognised. And I don't think we're far away. I think there is a real I think the dial is starting to shift, certainly in the conversations that I'm having. And we've got OE Global this year. There's this sort of, we've got a perfect storm coming. There's this awareness, and I feel incredibly hopeful for open practice in Australia. I really do.
Do you think that Plan X? Do you think that could be something moving towards? Oh, sorry. So I'm just wondering, do you think that we'll see a Plan S sort of approach what do you think that's possible? Is it something that's going to happen?
I think I think it'll be, and again, what do I know, right? But from my position, I think these things happen slowly and incrementally and they creep into practice. It's never a wave. It's a slow creep. And I feel like the again, the work you've done, Angie, which I just so admire, you know, like you've built an incredibly solid foundation that then I can, from my position in learning design, we can link arms with the library and we can start to work across and sort of say, like, this is a practice that we value and this is what we do and we have the skills here to do it. But it's expensive. We don't have the resources, we don't have the infrastructure, and we have to be patient. But every day a little bit more. And every day we get a little closer. Every day we have the skills and the capabilities built in people to be able to do this work. And it is complex work, which is why I say so many of us in higher education already were open. And to recognise that within ourselves and hold on to it and say, like, we can go this direction. We know what this is and we feel it. So yeah, I do, but I think there's patience involved. It's softly. Yeah.
I do also think that Erin nailed it with talking about where does open fit in with research, teaching and service. I think the ambiguity around where it fits in, I think that's a lot of the issue that we have trying to get people involved in these types of projects.
Next. We have one more question online and maybe another one. So I think this goes to all of you. Can you unpack the main equity challenges that face higher education and how can open education support us to be more equitable, to be more equitable places?
Okay, so I'm going to be talking for the next 6 hours. So if you need to go to the bathroom, go now. Okay, let's do it in a nutshell. I think, so of course, focusing as I do on disability, I think a lot of the times, again, we assume that equity forms certain boundaries, certain barriers, certain groups, certain cohorts. We tend to have a habit with looking at those groups that we'll then create further equity groups within those or miss the mark and create another minority group off to the side. So I think one of the key things with open practice to me is defining what we actually mean by equity, who we've covered within that scope, where the boundaries of that scope sit, how we've formed the boundaries of that scope, who's been at the table when we've been talking about these, and what assumptions we're making about that scope as well. So say, for example, an equity group could be people with disability. It's a group, right? But there are so many groups even within that. So who has a disability? What are we talking about as a disability? What is the definition of a disability? What about the actual types of disability? Are we looking at functional impairments from disability? Are we looking at the actual names of different disabilities? Are we looking at what language are we using? If we're talking to someone who comes from, say, India, there might be a different word used for a particular type of disability. Are we actually incorporating that into our definition? Are we communicating in the same way, again, talking on communication, that other people can understand what we mean by that equity group? So I'd love to say that it's an easy task to break apart those equity groups when it comes to open practice, but until we look at what we're actually talking about when we're talking about equity, we can't break down what those groups mean. Like you said before, we can't create that boundary around what this actually is. That then bleeds through to how we approach open practice, because our open practice will be exclusionary to some groups, not deliberately. We won't do that because we're horrible people. Ask my cat and he will disagree, but we won't do that because we're horrible. We will do that because we don't know better. Literally, we don't know. So it's my apologies, in a nutshell, it's a really big question. I would love to talk more about it. If they've got about 62 years to dedicate to me waxing lyrical about different definitions of language, different definitions of equity groups, everything like that, please do reach out.
So we've only got a few minutes left. Do we have a quick question from someone in the room? Nope. well, I might ask one then. So with open educational projects, often they are cross-institutional. Is that one way of getting a more representational resource available for use within Australian higher education?
Depends on what we class as representational, and depends again on those boundaries of who we're involving. So one of the things I talk about when I do my classes is immediately once we say what, okay, so we're disability, we're immediately setting a boundary. Immediately once we say, well, we're using this data to form our boundaries of representation, we're immediately setting again that boundary. So cross-unit collaboration, cross-industry collaboration are ways of reducing those kind of points of stigmatization, ostracization, othering, everything like that. But in some way, they will always be implicit in that development of that community as one of those boundaries. And that's where I think broadening out that we're not talking about just open education practice as one community. It needs to be those multiplicities of communities, that multiplicity of journey and discovery and understanding, because one is going to be so much different to the other. They will all be exclusionary in a way, and they will all be inclusive in a way, but they're just going to be different.
Okay, that's great. So I think we're coming up to the end. So does anyone have any final comments that they'd like to just say before we finish?
All the way back around to the beginning. The challenge has been set. This is Friday afternoon at the end of Open Access Week, right? We've had a few things to think about, I would imagine. There's been debates and conversations, but the challenge is set that we don't just have a week for things and walk away. And I suppose that was why the challenge was there at the beginning of where is the open in yourself and how can you fight for that from where you are, from the ground under your feet? And what does open look like for you and how can you enable it in other people? And I suppose it's in you and it's all around us, and it's kind of the fabric of what higher education was built from. It's what we're meant to be. We're meant to be able to be open with each other. And that's where real equity is in equitable exchange of philosophy and ideas and ways of being. And if we can't be open with each other, then that's the greatest challenge we face.
We're all off the edge of the map here. It's all a little bit crazy. It's all a little bit intense. It's all that process of discovery. I think as human beings, we always like that element of control. We like to be able to say, this is the scope of exactly what open is. This is the scope of exactly what you all need to do now. I would encourage you to look at your own maps there, your own journeys. In what ways are you already open and how have you already defined that? You'll each have your own definition to your own open practice. That definition might be something that's similar to someone else's. It might be something that's different, but it's still beautiful. It's still yours and it's still developing and it's still growing. You have people around you who can grow alongside you. We can't grow for you. You must always do that hard work yourself, but we'll be here as well.
It's been such a great privilege to be part of this conversation and a real learning experience for me. And I think one of the many things I'll take away from today is an affirmation that it's about community, not the individual. And I think so much of what we do in higher education puts an emphasis on the individual. So it's great to be part of a conversation that celebrates the community.
Right. I just wanted to finish off with a congratulations to Erin on such a fantastic resource. And just to point out that this beautiful cover was designed by one of her students as well. So so thanks to you guys for joining in our panel. It's been such a beautiful discussion. Thanks to Lisa for her assistance, to Dom and the Open Access Week committee for organising everything, for the wonderful Fernando for all of the tech, and for everyone who's come along to all of our events this week. It's been a fantastic week of amazing events. So that's about it for our online people. For the people in the room here, we now have drinks and nibbles out in the foyer. So thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed our event.